Today we're going to talk about what would happen if we didn't self-sabotage. What would happen if instead of sabotaging, we decided to stay curious? We're going to talk about replacing self-sabotage with curiosity and with steady consistency. Self-sabotage does not always show up dramatically. Sometimes it appears kind of quietly, kind of sneakily through overthinking, stepping back when progress feels uncertain, or just losing momentum when you're not getting the results that you want to see, that when the results aren't immediately visible. You might begin with a thoughtful plan and a strong intention that I'm going to follow through. And then along the way, your mind starts asking questions. Is this really working? Am I doing it the right way? Do I need to adjust something? And before long, the focus shifts from taking action to instead trying to solve the process perfectly. I know you've been there, so have I. And it's a very human response. When our brains feel uncertain or mentally overloaded, then it tries to conserve energy by stepping back from the process. So, what if you approached your health journey a little bit differently? Instead of trying to figure everything out before continuing, what if you just stayed curious long enough to see what happens if you didn't sabotage? Then the question becomes, what might happen if I stayed engaged instead of stepping back? You don't have to force success. You don't even have to stay in the process, or sorry, you don't have to force success, but just stay in the process long enough to observe the results. So imagine a scientist who's running a long-term experiment. She begins with a hypothesis and a plan. Then she runs the experiment and she carefully records what happens. Some days the results are exactly what she expected, and other days the results are confusing or they're slower than anticipated. But the scientist doesn't interpret those moments as failure. Instead, she records them as data. Each observation helps her understand the process a little bit better and then helps her to refine the next step. Now, imagine if a scientist abandoned an experiment every time the results weren't immediate or perfectly predictable. She would never discover anything. But by staying engaged, by observing, recording, adjusting, and continuing, then she gradually is able to uncover patterns that will lead to breakthroughs. And our health journeys work very much the same way. We already have a strong framework, nourishing meals, balanced portions, regular movement, and habits that support us. The key now is not finding a completely new system. There is no magic trick that is going to get us to where we need to go. We already have the magic. The key is staying engaged in the experiment long enough to see what the results reveal. Self-sabotage is rarely about laziness or lack of discipline. More often, it happens when our mental energy becomes depleted. When the brain spends a lot of time analyzing decisions, predicting outcomes, or trying to avoid mistakes, that slowly drains your energy. And then at that point, stepping away from the process feels way easier than continuing. This can create a pattern like learning and planning carefully, starting with good intentions, and then becoming mentally fatigued, and then pulling back or disengaging. The solution is not pushing harder. It's actually simplifying the process so that it requires less mental energy so that you can stay consistent. Now, there are subtle ways that self-sabotage shows up. You've already made meaningful progress in several areas, including showing more consistency, staying engaged with the process instead of constantly reworking the plan. You know what you need to do, and that kind of steady follow through is an important sign of growth. At the same time, there are a few patterns that can quietly slow our progress if we let them slowly creep back in. And these are very common, especially for those of us who like to understand what we're doing and why we're doing it. Some of those things include researching more information instead of applying what we already know. I love to research and I love to plan all of the lessons. And learning is valuable, teaching is valuable, but that often the next level of progress comes from implementing that knowledge that we already have. Another thing is waiting until you feel completely ready before committing. In reality, the readiness often grows through the action rather than before it. Stepping back when results aren't immediately visible. I get it. Physical change often happens, though, beneath the surface before it shows up in measurable ways. And then there's looking for a more refined system instead of continuing with the one that you already have in place. The plan that we have in place is the plan that works, and we have proven that when we have remained consistent. It might feel productive to search for the optimal approach, but meaningful results usually come from giving a solid plan enough time and consistency to work. And none of these tendencies mean that you're doing anything wrong. They're just signs or signals or data that your mind is trying to think through the process carefully. The key is remembering that the clarity often grows from consistent action, not endless refinement of the plan. So, how do we overcome this sabotage cycle? First thing, shift from analysis to short experiments. Instead of trying to determine whether the plan is perfect, why not treat it like a short-term experiment or maybe a long-term experiment? For example, you say, for the next 7 days, I'll follow my meal plan and just observe how it feels. Then at the end of the week, you ask yourself, what did I notice? And these reduce pressure and allow you to progress and to build more naturally. We've done that. There have been weeks where you realize, okay, I have a really busy week ahead. This isn't the week to be cooking. This is the week to do easy meals. So that's what you were able to notice from those weeks where you put the pressure on yourself to cook when you knew you weren't going to be able to cook. Use curiosity instead of criticism. When something doesn't go exactly as planned, rather than judge yourself, replace that judgment with observation. Instead of thinking, well, I messed this one up, instead ask yourself, what led to that decision? Curiosity is going to keep the learning process open, while criticism tends to shut it down. Another key thing is to reduce decision fatigue. One hidden form of sabotage is spending too much mental energy deciding what to do each day. So simplify a few hours, identify a few reliable meal options, especially for those busy weeks, maintain a consistent meal rhythm, which sometimes means eating the same thing or the same type of thing, and create a simple movement routine, one that you're able to do consistently. The fewer decisions you need to make, the easier it becomes to stay consistent. Something that I have noticed, if I prepare my breakfast or get everything ready for my breakfast the night before, then I actually have my prepared breakfast. If I don't prepare it the night before, and I get up a little bit late in the morning, or I get up and just think, I don't want to cook, then I end up getting myself a bagel at the coffee shop. But when I prepare that the night before, I don't have to make that decision in the morning. It's already made for me. Number four is to stay connected to the process. When your progress feels slow or uncertain, then it can be tempting to step back and try and figure everything out. alone or try and figure something else out. But growth happens faster when you stay connected and you talk through the process. You don't have to have everything solved before checking in with me. And often the most helpful conversations actually help when you're unsure, which you know by our coaching calls. On the weeks that you're struggling and we have a coaching call, you end up leaving feeling much more empowered and ready to take on the next week. Accountability is not about being perfect. So I don't need you to be perfect. Check in with me. Instead, accountability is about sharing your observations from your experiments so that we can interpret together. You might take a few minutes this week to reflect on these questions. When do I tend to step back from the process? What thoughts usually appear right before I disengage? What helps me stay curious instead of discouraged? And if I treated this week like an experiment, what would I want to observe? And these are going to help you shift the focus from judging yourself to understanding your patterns. Self-sabotage often comes from believing that you need certainty before you continue. But growth rarely begins with certainty. An experiment rarely starts with knowing the outcome. So growth begins with curiosity and a willingness to stay engaged. Instead of asking, will this work? Try asking, what might I discover by simply stay in the process? And you might be surprised what unfolds when you give the process enough time and consistency to show you its results. And remember, you don't have to interpret everything alone. One of the most valuable parts of coaching is observing the process together, making the adjustments when needed, and then celebrating the progress that comes from staying engaged in the journey.